It's the moment Jeffrey Epstein is asked about his friendship with Donald Trump, and it's going viral today.
That official conclusion has not satisfied a large segment of the public, and given the unusual string of coincidences, the failed cameras, the skipped checks, the removed cellmate, all occurring around. The death of a man who had deep, uncomfortable ties to some of the most powerful people in the world. The skepticism is understandable, even if it remains unproven. This is one of those rare places in the story where we have to be honest about the limits of what's actually been established. The official record says suicide. A great many people don't believe it. Both of those things are true. At the same time, and neither the official ruling nor the public doubt has been definitively resolved with new evidence since. Epstein's death meant he would never stand trial, never be forced to answer questions under oath, and never face the possibility of naming names. In exchange for a reduced sentence, a possibility that had reportedly worried a number of people in his orbit. But his death did not end the case, because Epstein was not operating alone. It's worth pausing here to talk about something that gets less attention than it deserves: the network of staff and associates around Epstein, who, according to survivor testimony and later legal filings, made his operation function on a day-to-day basis. Pilots who flew the planes, house managers who ran his properties, assistants who scheduled his days. Court records from Maxwell's own trial included testimony from one of Epstein's longtime private pilots who described years of flights between Epstein's properties, New York, Florida, New Mexico, and the private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands, without ever being told, by his account, what was happening. Once passengers arrived, none of this is to suggest that every employee in Epstein's orbit knew what was happening or was complicit in it. Plenty of people who worked for him over the years have said credibly that they had no knowledge of the abuse.
I'm Jeffrey Edward Epstein, and my residence address is 6100 Red Hook Boulevard in Virgin Islands. I have vacation homes in New Mexico, Palm Beach, New York, and Paris.
Have you ever been convicted of a crime?
Yes.
What was the crime of which you were convicted?
Two counts: one, soliciting prostitution, and procuring a minor for prostitution.
Did you in fact commit those acts?
I'm going to invoke my Fifth Amendment right.
How many times have you solicited a minor for prostitution?
Same answer.
How many times have you solicited a minor for prostitution in the state of Florida?
Same answer.
Have you ever solicited a minor for prostitution in the Virgin Islands?
Same answer.
That is, you are invoking your Fifth Amendment.
Yes, sir.
Right?
Yes, Mr. Squirrel.
But survivor accounts and court filings described a smaller circle of people close to Epstein who allegedly played direct logistical roles in facilitating his access to victims, arranging travel, and managing the day-to-day operation of his properties in ways that made the abuse possible to sustain for so long without outside detection. Names of several women who worked closely with Epstein surfaced repeatedly in unsealed civil filings and depositions. Over the years, described by accusers as having helped schedule and coordinate visits, very few of those individuals have ever faced criminal charges of their own, which is itself part of the broader pattern. This case keeps returning to an operation this expansive almost certainly required more than two people to sustain it. For over a decade, and yet the criminal justice system's final accounting names only two, which brings us to Ghislaine Maxwell. Maxwell was the daughter of a British media tycoon, Robert Maxwell, and she moved in elite social circles from a young age. She met Jeffrey Epstein in the early 1990s, and for the better part of 3 decades, she was arguably the single most important person in his life, and, prosecutors would later argue, in his crimes. According to the criminal case ultimately brought against her, Maxwell wasn't a passive bystander to Epstein's abuse. She was an active participant in building it. Prosecutors allege that she helped identify, recruit, and groom underage girls, building trust with them and their families, normalizing what would eventually happen at Epstein's properties, and in some cases, participating directly in the abuse herself. At trial, prosecutors pointed to financial records, showing Epstein transferred roughly $30 million to Maxwell. Over the years, which they argued was compensation for her role in the scheme, rather than simple generosity toward a former partner, survivors described her as the person who made the entire operation feel almost respectable, a well-spoken, sophisticated woman whose presence made a terrifying situation feel, to a frightened teenager, somehow safer than it actually was. That strategy, using a woman, and specifically a woman of Maxwell's social polish, to make the environment feel non-threatening, was something multiple accusers described independently. To investigators years apart, without having compared notes. It's one of the details that gave prosecutors confidence going into trial. The pattern didn't just repeat once, it repeated across more than a decade with different girls, in different locations, in almost exactly the same shape. During the month-long trial, several women testified about being approached as teenagers, some as young as 14, and drawn in through what prosecutors described as a deliberate grooming. Pipeline, an initial seemingly innocent introduction, often framed around massage or mentorship, followed by escalating requests. Over repeated visits with Maxwell frequently present for or directly involved in the earliest stages. One accuser, Annie Farmer, testified that she and her sister had tried to speak publicly about Epstein and Maxwell decades earlier, only to find themselves outmatched by the couple's wealth, legal resources, and social influence. A dynamic, several survivors said, was as central to the case as the abuse itself, not just what was allegedly done to them, but how long the people involved were able to prevent anyone from being believed. Maxwell was arrested at a New Hampshire property. In July 2020, months after Epstein's death had reopened public and legal pressure on the case. She went to trial. In Manhattan Federal Court, in late 2021, and on December 29, 2021, a jury convicted her on 5 of 6 counts, including sex trafficking of a minor and conspiracy to transport minors for illegal sexual activity. She was acquitted on 1 count. In June 2022, she was sentenced to 20 years in prison and fined $750,000, the maximum allowed under the charges. Speaking before sentencing, Maxwell called meeting Epstein the greatest regret of her life, while maintaining that she never abused anyone herself, a position her attorneys have continued to press through a series of appeals. A federal appeals court upheld her conviction in 2024, and the U.S. Supreme Court later declined to take up her case, though her legal team has continued to file new challenges since, arguing that evidence and information not available at trial should now void the verdict. Maxwell's own backstory adds a layer of context that's often overlooked. Her father, Robert Maxwell, was a controversial and enormously powerful British media magnate who died under mysterious circumstances. In 1991, falling from his yacht in the Atlantic Ocean, in a death that was officially ruled an accident, though it too has been the subject of ongoing speculation for decades. After his death, it emerged that Robert Maxwell's business empire had been built in part on massive fraudulent misuse of his company's pension funds, leaving his family's reputation in tatters, just as Ghislaine, then in her 20s, was trying to establish herself independently in society. The scandal wiped out much of what she might otherwise have inherited, both financially and socially, and left her needing to rebuild a version of the status her family name had once guaranteed automatically. Some who knew her at the time have suggested that this personal history, the sudden collapse of her father's empire and reputation, shaped her drive to rebuild status and financial security by any means available. Whatever the underlying motivation, the timeline is not in dispute. She relocated to New York in the early 1990s and quickly embedded herself in the city's elite social circles, cultivating relationships with wealthy and influential figures across finance, media, and politics. It was in that world not long after her father's death and her own reinvention, that she met Jeffrey Epstein, beginning a relationship that would define and ultimately end both of their public lives. What makes the Maxwell chapter of this story different from the rest of Epstein's network isn't just the scale of her alleged involvement. It's that she is, to date, the only person other than Epstein himself who has been convicted of a crime directly tied to the abuse, despite survivor accounts and years of legal filings, describing an operation that clearly involved far more hands than two. For years after Epstein's initial 2008 conviction, Maxwell faced no criminal charges at all. That changed. In July 2020, when federal prosecutors arrested her at a secluded property in New Hampshire, where she'd reportedly been living quietly under an assumed identity since Epstein's arrest the year before, she was charged with multiple counts related to the sexual abuse and trafficking of minors, spanning conduct going back to the mid-1990s. Her trial took place in late 2021, and it became, in many ways, the closest thing this case would ever get to real public accountability. Survivors testified in detail about the grooming process, how Maxwell would befriend them, ask about their lives and their families, buy them gifts, and slowly, deliberately normalize increasingly disturbing behavior until the abuse itself felt, to a manipulated and frightened teenager, almost inevitable. In December 2021, a jury convicted Ghislaine Maxwell on multiple felony counts, including sex trafficking of a minor. In June 2022, she was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. She has since appealed aspects of her conviction, though the core verdict and sentence have stood. Maxwell's defense team has continued to pursue various legal avenues since her sentencing, including requests related to her conditions of confinement and arguments about the scope of her original plea agreements with Epstein-era prosecutors. But none of these efforts have overturned the substance of her conviction. She remains incarcerated, and her case continues to be watched closely by journalists and survivors, alike in part because of persistent questions about whether she has provided or would ever provide investigators with additional information about others who may have been involved in Epstein's network. As of today, Ghislaine Maxwell remains the only person ever criminally convicted for participating in the Epstein trafficking network, not a single other associate, employee, or acquaintance, despite years of investigation, media scrutiny, and public pressure, has been criminally convicted of participating in the abuse itself. That single fact is, for a lot of people, the most disturbing part of this entire story. One predator operated for at least a decade with a documented recruitment pipeline of dozens of underage victims. And after everything, the original 2005 Palm Beach investigation, the 2008 plea deal, the 2019 federal indictment, Epstein's death, and Maxwell's trial. The final scoreboard reads one conviction, which brings us to the question that has driven more speculation, more conspiracy theorizing, and more genuine public anger than perhaps any other part of this saga, the so-called client list. For years, it's been an open question and a favorite subject of internet speculation. Did Jeffrey Epstein keep some kind of master list of powerful people who participated in, or at least knew about, his abuse of underage girls? The idea has fueled endless theories, partly because of how genuinely strange this case has been from the start, and partly because of a few real documented events that kept the speculation alive: civil lawsuits filed by Epstein's victims. Over the years, did name specific public figures as having interacted with Epstein in ways the accusers alleged were inappropriate or worse. One of the most prominent involved a member of the British royal family who was accused in a civil suit filed in the United States. That case was settled out of court. In 2022, with the royal family member paying an undisclosed sum while continuing to publicly and firmly deny any wrongdoing. It's worth repeating a point from earlier in this video because it applies directly here. A civil settlement is not a criminal conviction. Civil cases operate under a much lower burden of proof than criminal trials, and a settlement often reflects a decision to avoid the cost, publicity, and risk of prolonged litigation. It is not, on its own, a legal finding of guilt. Multiple other public figures have been named in various filings and depositions connected to this case. Over the years, and it's important to say clearly, several of those individuals have denied any wrongdoing, and being named in a civil filing or a flight log is simply not the same thing as being charged with or convicted of a crime. The client list speculation reached a fever pitch in early 2025. In February of that year, the sitting U.S. Attorney General made public comments, suggesting that a list of Epstein's clients was, in her words, sitting on her desk. For review, a statement that set off a wave of anticipation that some kind of major reveal was imminent. Almost immediately, that claim ran into a wall of internal contradiction. Reporting indicated that the FBI internally disputed the Attorney General's characterization, and no such definitive client list ever actually materialized publicly in the way the comment had implied. For weeks afterward, the discrepancy between the public statement and the internal pushback became its own story, feeding further distrust in how the government was handling, or mishandling, the case's remaining secrets. The story took its next major turn in July of 2025, when the Department of Justice released a formal memo on its findings. The conclusion was blunt, and for many observers who'd spent years anticipating a major breakthrough, deeply unsatisfying. The DOJ stated there was no evidence to support criminal charges against any additional, previously uncharged individuals. In other words, after everything, years of investigation, mountains of documents, endless public speculation, the government's official position was that the evidence simply wasn't there to charge anyone else. That memo triggered immediate backlash from segments of the public, from some of the survivors themselves, and from members of Congress on both sides of the aisle who felt the conclusion came without sufficient transparency into how it was reached. That conclusion did not end public pressure for transparency. If anything, it intensified it. And in November of 2025, Congress responded by passing the Epstein Files Transparency Act, a law specifically designed to force the release of government-held documents related to the case that had, until then, remained sealed, redacted, or simply unreleased. The bill passed with unusually broad, bipartisan support, a signal of just how much pressure had built up around this single issue. The result came in January of 2026. The Department of Justice released approximately 3.5 million pages of documents connected to the Epstein investigation. It stands as the largest single disclosure of records in the entire history of this case. The release itself was a legal obligation, not a voluntary gesture.
Within the 3 million some odd Jeffrey Epstein files released by the DOJ in recent weeks, hidden camera video is shedding light on a little known but critical story of Jeffrey Epstein's infamous Black Book. How did the FBI ultimately secure the only known copy? Jay O'Brien has a fascinating story in tonight's Prime Focus.
Who created this book?
Epstein himself.
This book was made by Epstein?
All his Mercedes, all his plane, they were supposed to have this.
It came in compliance with the Epstein Files Transparency Act, signed into law. That November, which set a hard deadline for the department to make its files public, the DOJ blew past that original deadline by more than a month, telling a federal judge. It was still sorting through millions of potentially responsive pages before finally publishing the bulk of the material. On a Friday in late January, when the dust settled, officials confirmed the total production included more than 2,000 videos and roughly 180,000 images, on top of the raw page count. Investigative journalists, researchers, and members of the public have been combing through that enormous trove of material in the months since. And here's where we have to be precise and honest with you rather than sensational. As of this recording, No confirmed new criminal charges against additional individuals have resulted from that release. That doesn't mean the documents contain nothing significant. A release of that size takes a very long time to fully process, cross-reference, and verify. But it does mean that so far, the release has not produced the kind of dramatic, headline-grabbing new prosecution that many people expected or hoped for. To give you a sense of what's actually inside a document release. Of that magnitude, it includes things like flight logs, financial records, deposition transcripts from years of civil litigation. The Epstein case also reveals something troubling about how wealth and access can insulate even the most serious allegations from serious scrutiny for years at a time. Long before the 2005 Palm Beach investigation ever began, Epstein had already built a social world that included prominent figures in finance, academia, science, and politics. That network wasn't incidental to the case. It became central to understanding how someone could operate for nearly a decade before local police even opened a file, when a massage therapist's mother called Palm Beach police. In March of 2005, to report that her 14-year-old daughter had been paid for a sexual encounter at Epstein's mansion, it set off an investigation that would eventually identify dozens, nearly all of them minors,
of which you were convicted.
Two counts, one soliciting prostitution and procuring a minor for prostitution.
minors at the time of the alleged abuse. Detectives conducted surveillance on the property, searched through the home's trash, and built what they believed was a strong case for multiple felony charges. What happened next is where much of the public anger still concentrates. Rather than face the charges, Palm Beach detectives recommended Epstein's legal team, which included some of the most well-connected defense attorneys in the country, negotiated directly with the U.S. Attorney's Office. The resulting non-prosecution agreement, finalized in 2008, allowed Epstein to plead guilty to only 2 state charges, one of which was soliciting prostitution from a minor. He served 13 months in a Palm Beach County facility, but even that sentence was softened considerably. He was granted work release 6 days a week, meaning he spent the bulk of his daylight hours outside the jail. At an office he maintained nearby. For many of the survivors who had cooperated with investigators, news of the deal and the work release arrangement felt like a second betrayal layered on top of the original harm, the agreement itself. If this video helped you understand the timeline more clearly, make sure to like it and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shape how we see justice, power, and accountability. Thanks for watching.